Today, we're giving the trenches their love and practice. And yes, we're finally going to talk about Desmond Ridder.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And we thank each and every one of you that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. Shout out to the everydayers who subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcast. So today we are going to talk about practice. Yes, we're going to talk about Desmond Ridder and practice later on today's show, but we'll start things off by giving some love to the trenches. It was the third day of pads in a row for the Atlanta Falcons. I saw a couple of national media folks in this at practice today in the various videos, Robert Mays, Albert Breer, some of those guys. So you'll probably hear a little bit more about, Falcons training camp from the national media over the next day or so. So be on the lookout for that. And we'll sort of see what we glean from their perspective. But today we get to talk a little bit more about the trenches who never get enough love, but because of those padded practices, we got some more one-on-ones from the offensive linemen and defensive linemen. And that's something, that we wanted to see. It's like, oh, D'Angelo Malone and Arnold Ebiketie, they do exist, right? They haven't been generating a ton of buzz, but, we got to see some reps of theirs and they started to generate maybe a little bit more buzz today in the third day of pads than they had over the previous week. But I'm not going to sit here and do what some of you guys think I should do and overanalyze 1 7-second clip of a practice rep. My general takeaway, watching several of those clips, I watched them all, don't get me wrong. I just don't necessarily feel compelled to provide the analysis on it. But my general takeaway watching several of those is like, the guys that you think are good look good. The guys that you're a little iffier on, you're like, nah, I'm still a little iffy on those guys. It's, kind of the theme of today's episode when we talk about practice. It's not about getting new information on these players. It's kind of about confirming your priors, which is part of the reason why I have my issues, but more on that later. So the other sort of big news of the day is related to injuries, right? Injuries do happen. And apparently they did happen. Excuse me. Sorry. To offensive lineman Ethan Greenidge, is carted off with a leg injury. Defensive pass rusher Ikenna Enechukwu also left like a play or so later with an injury, and we didn't get updates immediately after. We'll probably get some in the next day or so as the team gets more feedback on it. And of course, you hate to see that. You hate to hear about those injuries, but as I said, they are sort of inevitable. And both of those guys in Greenidge and Enechukwu were sort of battling for potential back-end roster spots. Greenidge was one of those guys that we thought maybe, okay, he could be the 8th or 9th offensive lineman. He had been getting reps over the last couple of days with Matt Hennessy also dealing with his own injury issues. Greenidge, it seemed like he was getting a lot of those second team reps behind Matthew Bergeron at that left guard position. But now you sort of sit there and go, if Greenidge is going to be out for an extended period of time, maybe this is the opportunity for a player like Justin Shaffer to make his name known a little bit more in this competition along the offensive line. And then with Enechukwu, not a player that we were necessarily projecting to make the roster, but certainly a prime candidate for the practice squad and a guy that was going to potentially push Ade Ogundeji, who apparently had a sack in some of the team sessions on today. And, that maybe opens the door, takes pressure off of Ade Ogundeji. Maybe it opens the door for someone like a Kamoko Toure, who we talked about when he's gotten opportunities to play in his NFL career, has been very productive, but just hasn't gotten too many of those opportunities because of various factors such as injuries. And maybe this is an opportunity for him to sort of stake his claim here in Atlanta. So we'll see about that. Also on the injury front, Jonnu Smith was absent for the second consecutive day. Arthur Smith gave us the update that there's nothing really to worry about on that front, and we'll probably hear something next week in Miami on his potential return. So they're not worried about that, whether that's, whether Johnny will be there for the joint practices or will be there in time for the preseason game. We'll just sort of have to see and get that update next week. But I think next week, is going to be a big week for this Falcon football team. It's going to be a big part of the evaluation. It's going to be a big part of the quarterback evaluation. Again, more on that later, but it's also going to, be a big week, particularly when it comes to the lead up to that preseason game next Friday against the Miami Dolphins, because if you're not healthy enough to practice on the Tuesday and Wednesday down in those joint practices in Miami, you're probably not going to play on Friday. So some of these guys, the Matt Hennessy's, the Ethan Greenidge, the Ikennachukwus, the Jonnu Smiths, Calais Campbell, we've talked about before, where it's like what their updates or what their status is, because we know that NFL teams are very conservative when it comes to playing guys in the preseason. If you're not 100%, they'll want to risk injuries and whatnot. But even if you are healthy for those joint practices, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to play in that upcoming preseason game, because we've seen the Falcons do some interesting things when it's come to how they've handled the joint practice weeks leading up to those preseason games. Like we saw in 21 against the Miami Dolphins, like the Falcons had a good set of practices, and then they, it was part of their overall strategy, but it was a contributing factor to why Arthur Smith was basically like, I don't need to play our guys in the preseason game because I liked our practice. Last year, they had their joint practices on this ahead of the second preseason game against the New York Jets, and that, according to various reports, did not go nearly as well. And the Falcons did play their guys in that preseason game. Now, they did play their starters in the first preseason game, both the offense and defense in the first preseason game against the Lions last summer, did get one series of work in that game. But then in the second preseason game against the Jets, the defense only got one series of work in that game, but the offense got 3 series of work in that game, basically playing the entire first quarter. So part of me wonders how Arthur Smith is going to handle that with the joint practices this time around. If we get a good week of practice with some of this defensive linemen, especially in the trenches, against the Dolphins, does that lead to the starters getting, no play in the Friday preseason game? Do they get some play in the preseason game? Do they get a quick hook? If they don't play well in those joint practices, do we see a more extended opportunity for some of these starters than, the sort of conventional series or two? So we'll see how that goes. We'll have to wait until next week to get that information, but hopefully, we'll get some more updates about these guys in the trenches, these young pass rushers, these Falcons offensive linemen are basically kicking the butts of the various Miami Dolphins players in next week's joint practice. So that's something we can look forward to next week. On today's episode, we can look forward to talking about the Falcons' potential formula success, which does hinge on their performance in the trenches, and that will be a prelude to our conversation about the Falcons quarterback in Desmond Ridder and why you don't really care about Desmond Ridder's practice habits, but we'll get to that a little bit later on today's Locked On Falcons. Now, guys, you know that the Falcons' success as a team depends on the team members that you kind of surround your quarterback with. And you may be a small business owner or a hiring manager that knows the same is true for your business. And it's a lot easier to put the right team around in your small business than it is for the Falcons, because you don't have to sweat out in the Georgia heat, but also you can go to LinkedIn Jobs where you can quickly attract and hire the qualified candidates by matching with the people that have the right skills, values, and experience that are going to help you achieve your goals. You can put your free job post in front of over 800 million profiles in minutes and find the most qualified candidates with LinkedIn Jobs. It's easy to screen and rate applicants based off the job qualifications on all on one platform. And it's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering those quality hires versus leading competitors. So LinkedIn Jobs is going to help you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So the Falcons' formula for success, right? And we have to constantly reiterate this because, people always, you got to be grounded in, what this team is and what their identity is. And, their formula for success, when you look back over the last couple of years, right? When we look at metrics like expected points added, EPA per pass play, or you look at adjusted net yards per attempt, Anya, right? Those are two metrics that myself and many others use as kind of the general measuring sticks of overall effectiveness, overall efficiency for NFL offenses. And if you average those two rankings for the Falcons in 2021 in 2022, right? In 2021, their average ranking in those two metrics was 22nd in the NFL. In 2022, it was 19th in the NFL. And then if you just look specifically at the 4 games that Desmond Ridder started and their rankings in those and extrapolate that for an entire season, they would have been the 21st best offense under Desmond Ridder compared to Marcus Mariota and Matt Ryan. So clearly there's kind of a well-established floor for this Falcons passing offense in the Arthur Smith offense. It seems like they're in that 19 to 22 range, slightly below average type of passing attack. But despite being a slightly below average passing attack, they've been very competitive over the last 2 seasons, right? They've been involved in 22 one-score games, which is the 5th highest number in the NFL over that 2-year span. They've won 12 of those games. There's one more than what you're expected to, because you're expected to basically go 500 in one-score football games. You win some, you lose some. We saw that. They won more in 21. They lost more in 22. It's interesting that the Falcons have been that competitive, despite the fact that if you do the same exercise looking at EPA per pass play or Anya for the defense, they've been a bottom 3 or bottom 5 defense in each of the last 2 years, right? They were 28th when you combine their rankings in 2021, and they were 30th this past year. And so that led to the Falcons doing what they did this offseason, which is investing significant free agent dollars in the defense to improve that side of the ball, which was clearly their biggest and most glaring weakness, right? And the reason why you do that in free agency versus the draft is because veterans tend to give you that instant impact, while draft players, and I constantly have to remind everybody of this every year, it takes like 2 or 3 years for these draft picks to really kind of move the needle for your football team. There are, of course, exceptions of guys that can come in and make a difference right away in the league. We're hoping that Bijan Robinson can be one of those exceptions to the rule. We'll see about that. But where does that kind of leave the 2023 Falcons, right? They're probably going to continue to get average to slightly below average play from their quarterback in Desmond Ridder, right? Right. It's probably going to be around that same sort of floor that we're talking about, being like the 19th best offense in the NFL, right? And now we hope for more. Right. Myself being, one of the quote unquote Ridder riders is certainly optimistic about what Ridder can bring to the table. But, at least in the early going, I don't expect him to be dramatically better than, the 19th, leading the 19th best offense in the NFL. Now, hopefully over the course of the season, we see things evolve. We see things develop, of course, as, a young quarterback accumulates experience. Those are things that you're hoping to see from him. Right? It's not where you start, it's where you finish. But, the idea of the Falcons being a very competitive team each and every week, given the expectations that they're going to probably have an average offense, right? And they were been competitive with an average offense and a bottom 5 defense. What's the world going to be like when the Falcons have an average offense and an average defense, right? And the question is going to be, does this defense sort of improve to that level, and how much improvement do they make? A lot of that depends on how good their pass rush, how good their secondary is. Again, no offense to the linebackers, but we know it's important to pressure the quarterback. It's important to lock down those weapons on the back end, and that can be big factors in determining your defensive success, right? And that's kind of the Falcons' formula for success. Basically, it's like, give me the 19th best offense, give me the 19th best defense, and in a weak NFC South, that's a recipe for success that this team can win many games and potentially be playing meaningful games in the month of January, something we have not seen for many years here in Atlanta. And, does that mean that the Falcons don't have the potential to be more than that this season? Sure. And they certainly doesn't reflect their potential to be more than that in the future seasons. I like this team's potential in the future, but they're probably years away from reaching that sort of potential. That's why yesterday on the podcast, when, I'm getting listener questions that are like adjacent to asking about, who can the Falcons beat in January, who they match up well in January, and, talking whether, tongue in cheekly about, Falcon players being Super Bowl MVPs again. And I get other feedback from other people suggesting that, this team is capable of winning a championship this year. I'm like, you probably should pump the brakes on that, right? Again, if and when we're talking about this Falcon team being a real contender, we're not talking about them being the 19th best offense in the NFL. It's more likely that we're talking about them being the ninth best offense in the NFL. And the same is true for the defense. And it's like, how do you go from 19th, where we kind of expect them to be right now, to the ninth best offense in the NFL? And a big part of that is seeing the development of their young quarterback and Desmond Ridder, as well as potentially adding more explosive playmakers, especially at the wide receiver position, which has been a frequent topic of discussion on this podcast over the last couple of months, right? As well as hoping that their offensive line and their run game can kind of just maintain, being the top 5, top 10 type of units that they currently are. The same when you look at the same question for the defense. How do they go from 19th to 9th, right? You're hoping that they establish a floor of a pass rush this year that's league average, right? Again, so much about the Atlanta Falcons is just shooting for mediocrity this year. And with this pass rush, it's like, can we just be a mediocre league average pass rush, get us 35, 40 sacks, something along those lines? And if you can establish that as your floor, then you can raise the ceiling, right? From, if that's the 19th, how do you get to 9? Okay, well, you establish that floor, you raise the ceiling, you get another pass rusher, potentially that alpha that we've been chasing for a decade since John Abraham's departure, that can reliably get you, double digit sacks. That's the piece that you need up front. You're hoping those linebackers, those often forgotten linebackers, you're hoping one of those guys, I'm looking at you, Troy Anderson, right? Maybe one of those guys, potentially develops into a Pro Bowl caliber player, can be one of the top 5 to 10 players at his respective position. And the same is true for several players in the secondary, how you get that top tier secondary. And hopefully you get the type of secondary that you can feel like what we felt like 6 years or so ago when we had Desmond Trufant and Robert Alford and Keanu Neal and Ricardo Allen at the tops of their games, where you feel pretty confident, regardless of who you're facing on a given week, that you're going to be able to match up with their skill position players, regardless who lines up. And so that's one of the reasons why, I feel like with the floor potentially established, I'm very optimistic about the direction of this team and the future of this Falcons football team, piggybacking on comments that you've heard from Arthur Blank, the Falcons owner, and general manager Terry Fontenot over probably the past 48 hours, across the internet, of talking about, 3-year plans and the direction of this team and all these various things. So the Falcons' formula for success and their identity is going to be based on being that physical football team, right? Going back to the trench conversation, right? It's going to be about winning in the trenches, right? And, I know a lot of people don't love that style of play, right? They find, dropping back and 40 and throwing the ball 40, 50 times and slinging it and putting up 30, 40 points as more aesthetically pleasing. I don't disagree with those people, that it certainly is more aesthetically pleasing to the eye to watch, the Kansas City Chiefs or the Cincinnati Bengals play football than necessarily what the Falcons are going to do on a weekly basis, which is just pound the rock, be physical, and basically play down to the wire in a lot of 24-21 type of ball games, and relying on Younghoe Koo to get you that victory in the end, or whatever it takes. So I get why there is some criticism and pushback amongst fans and outside observers about the style and the way that the Falcons are building their team. But I think that style can win you a lot of regular season games, right? It goes back to a conversation I've had on the podcast about, the 2 phases of football. We often look at the passing attack as the pitcher's duel, right? And then the other aspect, the more physical aspects, as the sort of rugby match, right? And the Falcons have not won very many rugby matches in their recent history over the last decade, and that's been kind of an Achilles heel of this offense, that when they've gotten into rugby matches, they have consistently lost to teams. Now, playing that style of football and trying to win the rugby match, again, I think that can win you a lot of regular season games. Is that going to win you a lot of postseason games? No, but at this point in time, I'm not really worried about winning, making deep postseason runs. I just want to get into the postseason. It's been 5 years, guys, since we've made the playoffs, right? I've been a Falcon fan for 30 years. In that period of time, until the last 5 years, never gone more than 3 years without the Falcons making the playoffs. So now I'm just itching. Just get me into the club. Get me into the dance. I'm just happy to be there at this point. I'll worry about, how many postseason games and how deep a run we can make once we get in the door. You know what I'm saying? I'm not going to start hitting on women if I'm trying to get in the club from outside the club. I got to get in the club first before I can start buying drinks. You know what I'm saying? So that's where I'll worry about that. If I'm broke, I got to cover job. the analogy is breaking down, but you get what I'm saying. So, that formula for success does not require the Falcons to have great quarterback play in order to achieve those goals, those short-term goals of just like getting in the club, right? We just need a quarterback that can just be decent to solid. And that will allow us to be able to exert our will in that rugby match. And, if push comes to shove, maybe we win a couple of pitchers duel or something like that. But I think Ridder can be that decent to solid quarterback. But that belief is not based off of any new information that we have learned about Desmond Ridder over the past 6 months. And so that's going to get us to our final conversation of the day, which is why you haven't heard me talking all that much about Desmond Ridder and his performances in practice on a daily basis on this podcast. And we'll break that down and basically why you don't really care about how Desmond Ridder practices each and every day. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, now that we're finally in August, it is fantasy draft season, and Underdog is the easiest place to play fantasy football because it is the best place to play best ball. And we've all had that experience of setting your lineup and then the guy on your bench goes off that week, or the guy that you did decide to start over that player completely fizzled, and it's incredibly frustrating. But that can't happen with best ball. It's one draft, no waivers, no trades. Underdog is going to set your best lineup each and every week, and you can try it out now with Underdog's Best Ball Mania tournament. It is the largest fantasy football contest of all time. It's back, and it's bigger than ever with $15 million, guys, in total prizes up for grabs, including $3 million going to the winner. And last year's winner drafted their team in July. So don't wait around by visiting underdogfantasy.com. Find them in the App Store, sign up with the promo code Locked On, and you'll get your first deposit doubled up to $100. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code Locked On. So before we wrap up today's episode, I'm going to give another special shout out to the everydayers out there that make this podcast their first listen. Tomorrow, your first listen will be a podcast that we are joined by Maria Martin of 11 Alive News, and we'll talk about Falcons training camp. I also teased on yesterday's episode that I was going to have a conversation with Pro Football Focus's John Macri about, Falcons players and their fantasy outlooks. I did have that conversation, but I'm probably going to drop that as a 6th episode this week on Saturday. So stay tuned for that as your first listen of the weekend, right? But let's wrap up today's first listen by talking about why practices don't matter. And when I say practices don't matter, I'm being hyperbolic, right? I'm exaggerating. Practices do matter for players and coaches that participate in the practices, but I don't think they really matter all that much for fans, right? If you look at it and you do the math and you look at OTAs and mini camps and training camp and regular season, postseason, whatever, let's say roughly an NFL team will conduct about 100 practices over the course of a year. And the 25 or so that we know of and focus on during training camp, right? They get a lot of attention. But there's no reason to think that any one of those practices during this time of year is any more meaningful than randomly picking another practice at any other point in the calendar, whether that's in April, whether that's in December, doesn't really matter, right? The only thing that really distinguishes practices this time of year from any other practices at any other point during the calendar is that these practices have a significant impact on who's going to be the 53 guys plus the 16 practice squad players, that are going to be on the team that will be able to participate in the roughly 50 plus practices that are going to occur during the regular season. Right. But when we get to those practices during the regular season, you don't really care about those practices. For all a good day of practice is a day that nobody gets hurt. Right. Which makes a day like today a bad day of practice, regardless of how players variously perform. Like, for example, if Maria Martin or Mike Rothstein of ESPN, tweets out like, I'm at Falcons practice, on a random Tuesday in November or Wednesday in November. Right. You're like, I don't see Cordero Patterson on the field. You go, gasp. What? Is CP hurt? Is he sick? What's going on? Where's CP at? Right? That's what you care about. Right? You're not sitting there going, gasp. I wonder if Desmond Ridder hit his deep ball to Cordero Hodge today in practice. Like, you don't worry about that. But for whatever reason, and understandable reasons. That's the thing that we tend to focus on this time of year when you don't really care about that at any other point this year. And there's no reason why you should care about that at this point this year than you do at any other point this year. But I get it. We focus on that because what else are we going to talk about? Fantasy football or whatever? Like there's nothing else to talk about. So, I get why we tend to focus on Desmond Ridder, because the biggest question surrounding the Atlanta Falcons this year is whether or not Desmond Ridder is good, right? That is going to be a big topic of discussion, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to talk about that each and every day in practice. We're not going to get the answer to that question based off of Desmond Ridder's daily performances in practice, and that's why it's not been a daily conversation here on this illustrious podcast, right? And I think the reason why we're not going to get that answer is because we're not getting any new information on Desmond Ridder or really any quarterback that we didn't already know 6 months ago. We've learned nothing about Desmond Ridder over the last 6 months other than I guess he's working hard to earn the respect of his teammates, right? Other than that, don't know anything about him that we didn't know about him 6 months ago, right? In practice, he makes some throws, he misses some throws. That's not new information. That's true of all quarterbacks, right? We talked earlier this offseason after the draft with Matt Wallman of the Rookie Scouting Portfolio about Desmond Ridder and his issues with Desmond Ridder and sort of Ridder's struggles against man coverage, right? Now, many young quarterbacks struggle against man coverage. I've been charting the Falcons defense since 2019, and I can vividly remember instances charting the defense when we played the Jacksonville Jaguars in that span, whether it was Gardner Minshew or Trevor Lawrence in those games, that when the Falcons decided to put man coverage, those passing offense just completely ceased to be able to function at a reasonable level. So that's true of a talent on Gardner Minshew's level. That's true of a talent on Trevor Lawrence's level. So that's certainly going to be true of a talent Desmond Ridder, wherever you fit him on that hierarchy. And so are you going to learn about Desmond Ridder's ability to carve up man coverage based off of how he performs in practice? No, right? The other concern you had about Desmond Ridder coming out of Cincinnati was his kind of spotty and erratic accuracy, right? His ball placement in that. And has that been an issue in practice? Yep, it has been. But did you think it wasn't going to be an issue in practice? Why wouldn't it continue to be an issue in practice, right? The correct answer is, yeah, it was going to continue to be an issue in practice, because just because you named Desmond Ridder the starter 6 months ago or 4 months ago, whenever that was, doesn't mean you just sort of snap your fingers and Desmond Ridder becomes immediately pinpoint accurate, right? There is a prevailing belief in today's NFL that did not exist 5 years ago and certainly did not exist 20 years ago, that you can improve the accuracy of young quarterbacks, that you don't have to sort of ding quarterbacks and say, well, if you were inaccurate at this point in your career, you'll always be that level of accuracy, right? That was the big conversation surrounding why teams bought so much into Anthony Richardson, why teams bought so much into Trey Lance. I guarantee you those guys had much bigger accuracy concerns coming out of college than Desmond Ridder had coming out of college. But yet you buy into that because you know that over time with reps, that is something that can be improved. So the fact is, we don't know anything new about Desmond Ridder just because immediately upon getting a couple more reps in this year's training camp than he got in last year's training camp, that he was able to, after a week, solve his accuracy issues. The other major concern that we had about Desmond Ridder that we've had for the last 6 months is, will he start hitting the deep ball, right? And that's going to be an important part of his evaluation this year, an important part of this team's success, right? You get in the rugby match, boom, 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 we're going to be physical, and that's going to suck up defenses, and you got to be able to go over the top and get those explosive plays, and that's going to do a lot to raise this offensive ceiling from being the 19th best offense in the league to potentially being the 15th best or the 13th best, or dare I say, the 9th best offense in the NFL. So it understandably gets a lot of attention if Desmond Ridder's not hitting his deep ball in practices. But did you think Desmond Ridder was going to just magically hit his deep ball in practice? Because deep ball is about touch, it's about timing, it's about building that rapport with your receivers, right? Matt Ryan had that right from the jump with Roddy White, but then the next couple of years didn't really have that, and then built it with Julio Jones. But you look at the Falcons' top 5 receivers this year, right, where Desmond Ridder is trying to build that touch and that rapport and that timing with, right? Drake London, Kyle Pitts, Mac Hollins, Scotty Miller, Jonnu Smith. Those are the 5 guys that we expect to get the bulk of the targets at the wide receiver and tight end position. You can throw Bijan Robinson into that conversation, right, as well. 6 guys, right? Only one of those guys has Desmond Ridder really gotten extensive work. The other guys are new to Atlanta, or players that he just did not get a ton of reps with last season, like Kyle Pitts. And so, like, did you expect that timing, that touch, all that rapport was going to be instant, and that was going to immediately come to fruition in the first week of practice? So again, we can go on, but basically the whole point is you're not getting any new information about Desmond Ridder in practice, right? The only time we're going to get new information about Desmond Ridder is when the games come in the regular season. Now, prior to that, we'll get some new information in the preseason games, because those at least somewhat simulate the regular season games to a certain extent. And so you can put a little bit more stock into Desmond Ridder's performances in those games as they translate to the regular season, as well as next week when we get to the joint practices. Those practices are not the same as your regular run-of-the-mill practices, right? You don't get 100 of those practices a year. You get 2, maybe 3 of those joint practices. So you put a little bit more stock in how Desmond Ridder looks against Miami's defensive starters in practice than you do against the Atlanta Falcons defensive starters in practice. So those are going to be a little bit more meaningful. We're going to glean a little bit more information, and it's, to me, worthwhile to pay more attention to Desmond Ridder in those practices as well as the upcoming preseason games. But everything else is like, whatever, man. I don't really care about that. It doesn't mean anything to me. I don't think it should mean anything to you. Right? It should mean everything to Desmond Ridder. It should mean everything to Jonnu Smith and Mac Hollins and Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith. But to you and I, it shouldn't mean really much of anything. So we're going to spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about Desmond Ridder. Guys, we're going to do all 22 reviews. We're going to do rapid reactions, crossovers all throughout the year. It's probably going to make up at least 15 to 20% of every podcast we do for the rest of the year. So I'm not really in any rush to get into those conversations at this point in the calendar year. But like, the last point I'll sit here and say is you got to give these young players, especially these young players on offense, room to grow, and especially Desmond Ridder. He's not going to be the fully formed version of, what Ryan Tannehill was in his 8th NFL season in Arthur Smith's offense. Hopefully he'll get there one day, but you got to worry about the floor and then work your way up to the ceiling. So that is sort of my final thoughts on why we don't spend enough time talking about Desmond Ridder. We'll talk more about Desmond Ridder next week when we get to those joint practices, when we get to the preseason games, but we're not going to spend every single day overreacting to what no new information about Desmond Ridder in practices. So I wanted to explain that to you guys. Tomorrow we'll be joined by Maria Martin to talk about what she's seen in practice. So maybe Maria will be much more willing to talk about Desmond Ridder on tomorrow's episode. You'll have to stay tuned. Make us your first listen on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure you check out all the various Locked On Atlanta shows, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.